You. Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Hunter Ohanian, and I'm the director of the Stonewall National Museum and Archives here in South Florida, in Fort Lauderdale. And I want to say hello to all of you and welcome our guest this evening, Ben Miller. Ben, say hello.
Hi, everybody.
Nice to see you. And Ben is coming to us from Berlin, and so we're very thankful for him. It is about 12:30 his time, so he promises to be very caffeinated and to be awake. And if he falls asleep, we will just give him a little nudge. And so
Well,
that's
I've been joking all year that I didn't move to Berlin to go to bed early, and this pandemic has been pushing it a little too far in the other direction. So I'm happy to stay up for you all tonight. It's a very good reason to do it.
I want to say hi to my colleague, Paula Sierra. Hello, Paula, how are you?
Hey, Hunter, I'm doing well.
Thank you. Paula's going to be behind the scenes here to make sure everything goes seamlessly. And so we're happy to have you here, Paula, and so thank you. And so for those of you, if this is your first time at a Stonewall event, we've been doing these talks for about a year. We started them during the COVID situation. And this is episode number 52, which is sort of astonishing that we have created this wonderful series of things that have happened. We record the show now, and then it will then go up on our website at stonewall-museum.org, and you can see it, or you can tell your friends about it, and they can see it as well. We think of them also as live programs and also as podcasts. I hear from a lot of people who just listen to these programs at night and at different times, and so that's great. We will allow questions for those of you who are here live. I tend to ask people to put those either in the chat or in the Q&A, and then the guest and I will get to those as we can. And we definitely will try to save a few minutes at the end for those questions to be asked as well too. I'll give some apologies. I'm having terrible allergies right now, so I'm sounding very nasally. Plus, I just flew to Baltimore yesterday and back today, so being on an airplane is always not great for my sinuses, but all's good. So I apologize for my voice. And for those of you who have not been to Stonewall National Museum and Archives in Fort Lauderdale, we've been around for 47 years. We're one of the largest LGBTQ libraries in the United States. We have 28,000 volumes in the library, which is kind of amazing, all organized under the Library of Congress system. Fiction, nonfiction, art, oversized, which of course is a category of the Library of Congress, biography. And you can actually search our card catalog online through our website at stonewall-museum.org. We have about 10,000 people a year come and take the books out or do research there, which is great. And then in addition to that, we have an archive. And the archive is 2,700 linear feet. And I always say, if you go all the way up one side of the Empire State Building and down the other, that's about 2,700 linear feet. It totals about 6 million pages of materials, mostly from the United States, but I would say probably about 5 or 7% is international, mostly English-speaking countries. But the material that we have from the US is really from all over the country, although we do have a focus on the southeastern United States, particularly Florida and everything west of Houston and south of Washington, D.C. So what's interesting is we have a lot of rural publications from the 70s and 80s and the 90s as well, which don't exist anyplace else. And it is one of the sort of second, third, fourth largest in the U.S. And so again, if you're here, please stop by and visit us. We're very happy to show it off. We also do exhibitions. Right now we have 2 of them that are up. And the exhibitions right now we do are exclusively focused on our archive. We've been doing archive-related exhibitions for about the last 2 years because we really wanted to get some of this work out on the walls. So the 2 shows we have up right now, one is called Off Our Backs, which is a look at early lesbian feminist publications from 1956 to 2000, which is great. And so it really talks about how women used publications in a very different way than men did at that time, in which men might have been objectifying themselves or others or fetishizing them. Women were far more practical about it in a lot of the publications. They were talking about sexual autonomy, they were talking about building community, they were talking about political freedom. And so it's very interesting to look at the dichotomy and the difference between those publications. The other exhibition that we'll have up all summer is something called Don't Ask, Do Tell, which is the history of the LGBTQ community and the US military, going back to the days of George Washington in 1778 and the time in which one of his lieutenants was in prison for sodomy, all the way up to the present day, in which we actually have a president of the United States that will have all members of the LGBTQ community serve in the military. And today in the US, we have 65,000 openly gay people serving in the US, which is astonishing. And so things have changed a tremendous amount, particularly over the last 20 or 30 years with the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy. And so it's a wonderful way of examining how political elections have had so much impact on how the US government's relationship with the LGBT community has happened. It has not been a consistent theme, of course, although I would say the majority of it has been anti-LGBTQ, but there have been these brief windows in which there has been acceptance. So please come by and see that. And if you are not on our mailing list, you can join us through stonewall-museum.org. You can sign up there. Of course, we're taking in donations probably 3 or 4 times a week. So if you have materials that you would like to have preserved, please, we always say, let us throw it away as opposed to you throwing it away. It's better to have us filter it and make sure that it's saved in some place. So bring us the boxes of stuff that you have and let us go through it. We are sort of moles in that way, and we can sniff out the good stuff pretty fast. And so let us take a look at it. So with all that being said, I think we're ready to go. And so Ben, again, thank you for being here. You and I met probably a year and a half ago at the Schwules Museum when I was working on an exhibition of Amos Banniger's work. And so it was great to meet you then. And you are, so what's it called if somebody's an American living in Berlin? This sounds very American, but you're not an expat. Expat is an American phrase. What's it called when somebody is an American living in Germany?
I don't know. I mean, there are quite a few of us. I think we throw the word expat around sometimes. I think, I don't know, I think there's a way of identifying as a migrant or as an immigrant that to me would feel like claiming a kind of oppression that a white man with a US passport in the European Union does not actually encounter. But then perhaps there's also some possibility for solidarity in that. So maybe we can call me an immigrant.
Hmm. So what brought you to Berlin?
Well, first time studying in the city and a kind of very sort of, I would say, deep and multi-leveled attraction to various things about the city, the way that it embodies history, the people and the subcultures and the communities that are able to still be here, the ghosts that are absolutely everywhere, and then also, and very pragmatically, research money and a community of fellow researchers and also artists, visual artists and writers and other people with whom I feel like I'm constantly able to be in collaboration and conversation, and that's a really extraordinary feeling. And I feel very, very lucky to be here and to be around the people that I'm around and to have them put up with me and to be able to make work together.
Yeah, it's great that you've been able to find that community. I'm just looking at some of your bio here, and of course, but people can see your bio on our website here. Um, and So you serve on the board of the Schwules Museum. We'll talk about that in a minute. But tell us a little bit about your day job now.
Well, so at the moment, I am a doctoral fellow at the Graduate School of Global Intellectual History at the Free University. And so this is it's a different university structure. We're not in a department system, but basically they have funding for 3 cohorts of grad students. And I'm in the second group of 12 really brilliant colleagues from all over the world who are working on various kinds of global intellectual history projects. So histories of ideas that do not take national borders as their kind of primary organizing principle. And so the project that I'm working on right now in my own work, my own research, is about primitivism and the rise of gay liberation between the Weimar period in Berlin and its environs, and then California in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And those are actually sites that are linked not only by the kind of resonance of similar ideas in similar places, or similar ideas and kind of similar social structures in those different places, but also by this kind of gossamer network of links and connections and who slept with who and all of that. So that's what the project is about, and I'm lucky enough to have that be my day job for the moment.
Which is great. And do you have a projected completion date for that project?
I do. They will stop paying me in October of 2023, so I better be done by then.
So it'll be time to have it done then. Well, we look forward to that. And of course, there have been many other projects that you've worked on, and we're going to talk about one in a moment. But I'm just looking here and to see that, you know, your fiction and reviews have been published by the New York Times, Literary Hub, Tin House, Los Angeles Review of Books, and many others. And so it's great that you've been getting that work out there, and that it's been getting a good response. And I happen to have this project here, a public apology to the Siksika Nation, to the at the Toronto Biennial of Arts by A.A. Bronson, with an essay by you. And of course, you worked on this book with A.A. Bronson. Tell us a little bit about this project.
This is a really extraordinary project, and this is again one of these things I've been lucky enough to be involved in that really just feels like it feels like such important work, and such an honor to be kind of a fly on the wall for it. So A.A. Bronson, who some people listening may know, is a very well-known queer conceptual artist who was for a time part of a collective, a media art collective called General Idea, one of 3, along with Jorge and Felix, both of whom died in the epidemic in the 1990s. A.A. survived them and then began to make work, much of which was about sort of the fact of his survival and the trauma of that survival and healing, and became interested in these things. And in the course of family research, A.A. discovered, or he had known for some time, it sort of kept coming back to the story, that his great-grandfather, the Reverend J.W. Timms, had been the first Anglican missionary sent after the signing of the Sixth Treaty between the First Nations of Canada and the British Crown, to be the missionary to the Siksika Nation, which is one of or Blackfoot Confederacy First Nations, a couple which are in present-day Montana and a couple in present-day Canada. And had the family story was that he had essentially been run off the land by some kind of rebellion, and there wasn't much talk about why. And A.A. became interested in this story, I think, especially in the aftermath of the Truth and Reconciliation report about abuse in residential schools in Canada that came out a couple of years ago, and began to kind of prepare or try to think about what a way of addressing that history would look like that was meaningful and real. And then discovered that there's an artist named Adrian Stimson, who is the great-grandson of Old Son, who was one of the Siksika chiefs at the time that A.A.'s great-grandfather was the missionary, who is also a queer performance artist, and who lives on Siksika, and the two of them had shared networks and et cetera in the past. And so A.A. approached Adrian about thinking about something along the lines of these projects, and it was funded by a grant from the Canada Council. And so I was brought on to dip into the archive and try to figure out what exactly had happened. Like what was the story here? And there are a lot of sort of unsatisfying histories. And I'll let people, I mean, the book is findable. The essay's on my site, people can find it. I don't want to summarize the conclusions too much because I think it's really important to sort of see it all out there. But we tried to figure out what exactly it was that had happened. And I mean, one of the big takeaways, not that this is any surprise to anybody who knows anything about the history of these residential schools, and I think the discovery of these mass graves across present day Canada, and by the way, these mass graves are in the present day United States too. It's just in Canada they have done a bit more work to the point that we now find out about them, and it's a sort of public topic, but this is in no way something that wasn't happening south of the border as well. That the mass torture and abuse and murder of children was a part of the process by which the United States and Canada were settled, and that the Reverend Timms and the school that he founded was part of that system of torture and abuse and murder. And so AA developed, attempted to develop some kind of gesture of conciliation towards that, and Adrian responded with some work. And I actually wanted to briefly show something, that this is a book, and this is also available, that Adrian produced of sort of in response to AA's work and to the essay. And the bulk of this photographic work is the class pictures from his father's class at this residential school, which was the same school that, the same abusive school that AA's great-grandfather had founded. And Adrian's work is also, and that name is Adrian Stimson, S-T-I-M-S-O-N. And I think Adrian's work is potentially a really good place to start for folks who have been hearing about this in the news and are now thinking, maybe didn't know that this had happened and are trying to begin to educate themselves about what happened. And we also have a reading list in the back of that book, which contains a lot of sources by Indigenous scholars and Indigenous activists, and I would really recommend that people start there.
It's so fascinating. And again, if you have not read this particular apology, it's really just amazing. It's an amazing story, and I'm happy to see all of these stories coming out. They're sad, of course, on one hand, to realize that this history has happened, but it's very heartening to see that the history is being told out there. But yeah, I don't know
if I want to give people that much credit, but yeah. I mean, I think it's an ethical duty to come to terms with it. I don't want to congratulate anybody for doing that.
Yeah.
Or myself.
But so as I think about you talking about this today, and possibly 10 or 15 years ago, and thinking about you sort of being outside of Boston and growing up outside of Boston, and maybe going to the Chestnut Hill Mall to get a soda or an ice cream, and thinking about being there. Did you at any point imagine at that period of time you would be on this path of looking at queer history in this particular way that you are today?
Oh, I don't know. I think I continue to be very grateful that I've been able to work on things that really move me, and I think that's a luck and a privilege, and yeah, I really don't take it for granted.
Yeah, that's a wonderful way of thinking about it, in the sense we get to find these paths, and that if, of course, we can't take them for granted. So you have another role, of course, is the one that I referred to earlier, which is you have been elected to the board of the Schwules Museum in Berlin. You are a board member there. And for those of you who don't know the Schwules, it is one of the, I'd like to say, it's the other gay art museum, although that's not quite right. But we have the Leslie Lohman Museum of Gay and Lesbian Art in New York. And then I always have thought of the Schwules Museum as a very comparable museum in Berlin, which has a wonderful history. But you serve on the board there. And I think what's interesting about the Schwules, at least my understanding, which is different than Leslie Lohman, is that the Schwules puts art on the wall and has wonderful exhibition spaces, but then also it has an amazing archive and has an amazing library as well too. So it's museum, it's library, and archive all in the same place. And then structurally, my sense of it is that while it does get some institutional support from the government, it really does kind of work as a collective in many ways. Tries to be tries to be horizontal as opposed to a lateral structure, which many other organizations are out there. And also, like many of these gay organizations, which have been founded by white gay men, we all know that's true. It tries to honor those, but works very hard to try to be sure that other voices, contemporary voices, are not only reflected on the walls, but are reflected in every aspect of the organization. So, I mean, that's my 2 cents about it. Tell me what the real facts are.
Yeah, I think you pretty much got it. I mean, we were founded in 1984 by a group of people who are very much coming out of this kind of gay liberation spirit of the long 1960s and the 1970s. And we have evolved into an institution with, we say we have 2 million archival objects. We have a very large basement full of them. And we also have several hundred square meters gallery space. And the combination of those things is really important. And then we also have about 10 employees at this point because we are able to count on generous arts funding just in the German national context, which is really good, to put it in a very stupid way. And then, yeah, we've maintained democratically controlled structures that we do not have an executive director. The museum is governed by an elected board, and I'm one of 10 people who has been elected to oversee basically all major decision making there. And it's a struggle and it's a challenge. And, you know, if you live for drama a little bit, it makes it a little more fun. But, you know, we managed to keep the lights on and the bills paid. And I think we really have actually, over the past 10 years institutionally, I've only been there for 2, so it's not, I'm not saying this, I did it. But collectively and institutionally, I think we've executed a really tremendous amount of growth over the last 10 years, not just in terms of physical plant, but in terms of what our capacities are, in terms of what communities we're speaking to, in terms of how well we're doing what we do. And so it's always kind of, it's always this kind of evolving thing, and it's important to me to be part of it because it was actually one of the first queer archives I ever went to, and I remember when I first went in, I almost cry when I say it. It's very, very moving. There was a very rich print culture of gay and lesbian and trans magazines in the Weimar era, and the originals are, of course, very, very delicate and very, very precious, and oftentimes there's only 1 or 2. And so volunteers, at some point in the 1990s, went around all of Germany. We have some of the originals, we don't have all of them. Photocopied them all, put every single one of these into complete print runs, photocopied in binders, beautiful photocopies in chronological order. And you go and you work with something like that, and you think, my God, if I've been lucky enough to go in and find this sitting here waiting for me, and it's made my work possible because I don't have to go hunt down every single one of these things, then I have something to do. You know, you need to do that for the next person, or help do that for the next person, or be part of it for the next person. And so that's what I'm trying to do there, and also to help. I don't know. I think sometimes to try to figure out how to, because I mean I work on histories of, and this because of I mean, I work on recent enough history that I'm lucky enough to be often writing about people, or sometimes writing about people who are still living, and or at least in a language that feels like it's in some sense still living, right? And in some of these generational and identity-based transitions that we've been talking about, to be able to try to translate between some of these different languages, that's something that I think I can help with or do, and have been trying to work on there. But yeah, everyone should check us out, and anyone who's, as travel reopens, if you come through Berlin, do come check us out. We always have 3 or 4 shows up and events going on, and it's a really great place.
Yeah, no, it's a wonderful spot if you've not been there, and so it's great to visit it. I one question when you talked a little bit about the funding there, is it that is it the German government that actually, it's the nation of Germany provides funding? And the reason
Flows
why
down through the states. It flows down through the states. So Germany's a federal republic, just like the US, and Berlin is a state, just like a US state would be, or a city state. And so, yep, the federal government funds Berlin, X for culture, and we get a very stable, guaranteed amount.
Which, of course, in the US, we'd love to be able to see that kind of support for many queer archives here. And
we would love to be able to see that kind of support for the arts in general. I mean, the stat I like to use is that Berlin alone, only on opera, spends more every year than the United States does on culture.
I love those. It's like the city of New York spends more than what the NEA spends. And so love the idea of the fact that we are pointing out the paucity of support that the federal government in this country has for arts.
Nothing. And people think it's 2% of GDP, and I wish it was.
And you guys are open now. I was seeing it.
We are. Yes,
yeah,
we're open. We're open. We're back open. We were closed for a very long time, but we're even doing our first little events, which is very exciting. So it's nice to remember that it's actually a museum and not just a series of Zoom meetings.
Good. All right. So when I started this series, like a year ago, as I was saying, we were talking about, oh, this wonderful gay writer and this wonderful gay artist, and let's talk about this gay figure in history. And I was going through maybe 10 episodes or maybe 20 episodes, and I was beginning to think like, well, wait a minute, everybody in the gay world is perfect, everybody's wonderful, everybody's great. And I started thinking about the idea, well, that can't be true. And so I thought back to our conversation about bad gays. And I thought about the idea that we, as people who care about LGBTQ civil rights, who want to educate our own generations as well as future generations about role models and positive things, and want to provide a lot of positive aspects out there. As historians and researchers and writers, our job is to tell the truth. You know, it's one thing to talk about the Renaissance and to talk about wonderful paintings, but then you also have to talk about how they fought and threw dead donkeys over the wall at each other. You have to talk about, you know, the awfulness of what those societies were. And so I started thinking about the idea that, you know, we've been talking so much about the positive side of it, and I'm not trying to put a negative spin on LGBTQ culture, but just like anything else, there are some bad folks out there, and there are definitely some bad gays. And that again brought me back to you. And I did a little research and of course saw that your podcast, I think I saw something, is this true? There've been over 500,000 downloads of your—
We've been downloaded over 500,000 times. And actually what I'm going to share with you tonight is a sneak preview of an upcoming book. And so this is material from the introduction that we've developed and serves as a kind of manifesto for the project. So I think you'll get some of a sense of it. But yeah, it's a project that I work on with a friend and a very brilliant collaborator, writer and novelist named Lemmey, who's based in Barcelona, who's originally English. And we started the show thinking it was going to be for 4 people. And then it's been completely, I mean, we're not distributed, we have no media, there's no ads, there's nothing, and we've managed to find an audience for it. And I think it really speaks to the fact that people are really ready for queer narratives that are not on a 101 level. And I think the assumption that gets made by a lot of media people is that anything about queer lives or people has to be really, really basic and really, really remedial. And we start not from the perspective that we're talking to academics, but from the perspective that we're talking to people who have some sense of what we're talking about. And just assuming that your audience is not stupid is, I think, a good place to start. And it's enabled us to have some complicated and important conversations. And hopefully this preview that you get tonight, which again, I want to emphasize many times, what I'm reading to you is the sort of collective work of Hugh and I, or is taken from the collective work of Hugh and I. hopefully it's a kind of manifesto and a call to arms and an introduction maybe to what our project is all about. So I think I'll just start then.
Great.
I'm going to share some slides in our eye-searing color palette and I'll get going. So in 1891, Oscar Wilde's star was on the rise. For a decade, he'd been the toast and talk of London, a literary wit pioneering the fashion and philosophy of asceticism. He had successfully published works of prose and collections of poetry and was preparing his first novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, for publication, a masterful account of a Faustian bargain of desire, vanity, and corruption. But within 5 years, Wilde's reputation and his health were destroyed. Sentenced to 2 years of backbreaking hard labor, he was spat at by strangers as he was transported via train to jail. Upon release, he fled into exile, living in penury under an assumed name. And less than a decade after he had reached the heights of literary stardom, Wilde was dead. It's right and proper that we remember the role Wilde played within an otherwise staid and repressive Victorian culture, as well as the important pioneering work he did in describing in public a form of same-sex desire that otherwise lay hidden and criminalized on the margins. Wilde was one of the first men in British society to give a creative form to a sexuality that barely yet understood itself, let alone was understood by others. For that, conservative forces succeeded in destroying him, but at the core of Wilde's story is his love for a truly terrible young man, a love that drove him close to madness and was the spark of the wildfire of events that led to his ruin. That boy pictured to Wilde's right, a petulant and cruel son of the petulant and cruel British aristocracy, was Lord Alfred Douglas, known by his affectionate nickname of Bosie. They met in 1891. Bosie was 21, an archetypal twink, an undergraduate at Magdalen College, Oxford, who cared more about his writing and activities in the new Uranian poetry movement, which idolized pederastic relationships between older and younger men, than his studies, which he would never complete. Their tempestuous affair pushed Wilde's sexuality from the realm of flirtatious literary gossip into that of reckless public identity. Besotted with the young poet, Wilde fell in with his lifestyle, indulged his demands. They drank and partied together and became the subject of scurrilous rumors, hosted wild sex parties with young working-class men. Wilde's public image, an educated and charming raconteur, but married with children, clashed with his private life, and while the conflict could hold for a few years, it wasn't long before the inevitable happened. After clashing with Bosie's father, the cruel and vituperative Marquess of Queensberry, he was left a calling card from the Marquess accusing him of being a sodomite. Queensberry, who had 2 homosexual sons who he regarded as having been corrupted by snob queers such as Wilde, was obsessed with homosexuality. And while Wilde's friends told him to leave the case alone, Wilde was pushed by an impetuous and jealous Bosie who hated his father and sued. There was a fatal hole in Wilde's case. He was a sodomite, and Queensberry could prove it. The civil trial not only humiliated Wilde, but instigated a further criminal trial for gross indecency. Wilde was found guilty, and his prison sentence and further demise were sealed. Wilde's imprisonment, as awful and scandalous as it was, came at what was both a dangerous and an auspicious time for the new figure of the homosexual in Europe. Within certain small literary and scientific circles, a new identity was forming. Sexologists described a third sex, somewhere between male and female. People who became the first generation of activists pursuing something we might recognize as gay rights began discussing same-sex desires with sensitivity, even respect. For such people, Wilde's trial was an important moment in the development of what would, in the ensuing decade, become a campaign for LGBTQ rights. Scandals, after all, brought public attention. Newspapers wrote about these dangerous homosexuals, and more people began to recognize themselves as such, and be endangered or intrigued by what that recognition might mean. Wilde's utopian vision of love between men is commonly remembered in Britain and beyond as a creation myth of the public male homosexual identity. In his trial, Wilde launched a passionate defense of homosexual desire, saying, "It is in this century misunderstood, so much misunderstood that it may be described as the love that dare not speak its name, and on that account of it, I am placed where I am now. It is beautiful, it is fine, it is the noblest form of affection. There is nothing unnatural about it." Such a statement can almost be seen as a rallying cry for the century of activism that was to follow, and Wilde became one of that activist movement's first martyrs. Bosie became a footnote in the story. an embodiment of evil twink energy, a poison apple whose path through life led a wake of destruction that led to the great hero's downfall. Yet Bosie, the man, his desires, his attitudes, his foibles were just as integral to the eruption of homosexuality into the public sphere as Wilde's. Bosie set the trial in motion. Indeed, it was actually Bosie, and not Wilde, who coined the term "the love that dare not speak his name" in one of his poems. No less than Wilde, Bosie shaped and was shaped by the sexual attitudes and cultures of his time. And Bosie's later life of far-right political involvement is just as illuminating as his years with Oscar. After Wilde's death, he wrote articles for the anti-Semitic magazine Vigilante, accusing various people of plots to undermine British masculinity with Jewish homosexuality. And in 1920, co-founded a magazine called Plain English that advertised copies of the anti-Semitic conspiracy, The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. After a period of imprisonment, he died poor and obscure in 1945. Only 2 people attended his funeral. For years, gay people have remembered Oscar as one of our own, but have neglected Bosie as someone who has anything to tell us about how homosexuality came to be. Why do we choose to remember the witty and glamorous Wilde and to forget the Machiavellian, anti-Semitic, and louche Bosie? And more crucially, why do we assume that Wilde's life and attitudes shaped the track record of the project of homosexuality better than Bosie's? Bosie was hardly the first gay to become obsessed with far-right or racist politics, or to confuse the freedom to live out his elevated class status and desires at the same time with liberation. Bad Gays is a project about such characters, about the gay people in history who do not flatter us and whom we cannot make into heroes, the liars, the powerful, the criminal. Unlike our heroes, we rarely remember them as gay, and yet their sexuality was just as important an influence on their lives as those whom we celebrate, and their stories have much to tell us about how the sexual identities we understand today came to exist. By examining the interplay of their lives and their sexualities, this project investigates the birth, life, and failure of homosexuality as an identity and a political project. Failure seems like a harsh word, and this assessment, while our primary framework in this project, is of course incomplete. There is indeed hope for queer forms, and there are of course histories of struggle, alliance, and solidarity that we can remember to inspire contemporary action. But we must think about how these histories and the darker stories of the bad gays can and should exist in productive tension as we think about the past and future of queer lives in Europe and the United States. The failure, however, of mainstream actually existing homosexuality to enact liberation, and its embrace instead of full integration into the burning house of the couple form, the family unit, and what we might hopefully call late-stage racial capitalism, is real and is arranged on 3 primary axes. First, its separation from and fear of gender nonconformity. Second, its simultaneous appropriation of the bodies and sexualities of racialized people and denial of those people's full humanity, political participation, and equality. And thirdly, its incessant focus on the bourgeois project of sexuality itself. The first theme is explored in the scholarly work of people like Susan Stryker, who have pointed out that homosexuality's project of self-justification has often claimed on defending a kind of normalcy at the expense of a gender nonconforming other, the trans woman, the straight queen, the person not respectable enough to pass. The second is examined by people like C. Riley Snorton, Joel Still Peterson, Ann Stoller, and Anne McClintock, who have described the ways that the bodies of and ideas about the social organizational of racialized and colonized people have served as the metaphorical and often the literal substance of white metropolitan homosexual identities. And the third has been discussed by a variety of queer Marxist scholars, from gay liberationists themselves, to classic texts on the emergence of gay identity and its relationship to capitalism, to Chris Chitty's recent intervention into the correspondence between crises of capitalism and the persecution of poor and working class homosexuals. But our project aims to step out of the academy and explore these themes not through scholarly argument, but through storytelling. By retelling the stories of a set of queer lives that are individually fascinating and horrifying, and that collectively communicate a version, our version, of the story of the evolution and failure of homosexual identities. It can be easy to assume sometimes that the way that we think about identities has always been the same. Things like our race, our gender, our sexual orientation, our nationality can seem like such an important intrinsic part of ourselves that we assume they must have been important for people living in the past as well. But identities are, as the trans historian Susan Stryker has said, where the rubber of larger social and cultural systems hits the road of lived experience. They are constantly changing and being changed by the realities of life, by our experiences, by systems of production and exchange, by the ways that we relate to one another. Even the idea that people have a specific sexuality is remarkably recent, perhaps only 150 years old, emerging in the rapidly industrializing colonial metropolises of 19th century Europe. The rigid segmentation of time into separated zones of work and leisure, along with moral panics about backwards people intended to justify both colonial expansion and incursions into the supposedly immoral private lives of the new working classes, inculcated the idea that who you fucked made you who you were. Even after the invention of homosexuality and heterosexuality in the late 19th century, most people who felt same-sex love and desire did not want to convert their feelings into identities, to subscribe to being medicalized and set apart. These feelings were instead often sources of shame, or crimes for which they could be punished, or social taboos. As some people began to fight for their recognition against medicalizing systems, movements began to emerge. But the people who led these movements, at least the movements that have succeeded in winning state recognition, were often not working class people or people of color, but instead members of the emerging bourgeoisie who sought to assign positive values to their sexual acts within the prevailing value systems of their class and time, and often, as we will see in this project, to bad ends. At the same time, working class people, colonized people, and people of color have consistently lived, fought for, manifested, and expressed forms of social and sexual life that have challenged both dominant phobic attitudes towards all gender and sexual minorities and the politics of the gay elite. These challenges have often been bitterly resisted by that elite in their time, while still, due to their embrace of mass politics, disruptive organizing, and attacks on deeply troubled ways of life, having far-reaching effects in all of our queer lives. Often after the fact, that queer elite will belatedly acknowledge the people, movements, and struggles as an attempt to incorporate them into the dominant story of what it means to be gay or lesbian or trans, as though the working class kids, sex workers, drag queens, and trans women of color at Stonewall threw bricks at cops in order to win marriage equality for the gay and lesbian donor class. But it is this process of struggle and contestation that has created the very idea of what being gay or queer is, from producing a queer culture, discussing queer lives, and finding historical examples of similar lives that have been suppressed. Even the term gay has changed. 50 years ago, the term had a broader meaning that would have included queer and bisexual people, transgender people, transvestites, and more, anyone who lived openly outside the heterosexual and cis-sexist norms of a more conservative society. Today, it tends to refer to a more limited idea of same-gender sexual attraction. These definitions, too, are sites of struggle and negotiation. It can therefore be difficult to find the right terminology to discuss people who fit into such a category today when ideas and identities like this didn't exist in their time. Can you call someone like King James I and VI of England and Scotland, a man who almost certainly had sex with other men, a homosexual, when that identity didn't even exist as a concept at that time? When he was ruling England and Scotland and beginning his campaigns of colonization in Ireland and America, nobody would have thought who they fucked had anything to do with who they were. So what does it mean to call James, or the Emperor Hadrian, or Frederick the Great, or any number of the nefarious Nellies from history that we profile here, gay? We'd like to use that term, imprecise as it is, from the present, as a way of putting today's homosexuality under a microscope and figuring out why it is troubled and incomplete. By discussing these people and their shared behaviors in relationship to each other, we can begin to draw out characteristics and stories that might shed a light on how a contemporary gay identity came to exist. From ideas of what it means to be a man, to how same-sex desire has influenced major historical events, to how the dreaded heterosexuals came to exist, to understand themselves as opposed to queers and to fear, police, and repress us. Our subjects may not have held a gay identity, but their lives can tell us so much about why we do. And if gay is an imprecise term of convenience, then so certainly is bad. While some of the folks in the project are without doubt bad, fascists and murderers, many are a bit more complicated. We look at their lives in the context of the times in which they lived and how their decisions were guided by those contexts, by insights, and by the considerations of their sex lives. Many were profoundly traumatized by the guilt they felt as a result of their sexual desires. Pushed by society into lives they found themselves unable to lead, they made strange choices or ended up damaging the world in their efforts to reform it. So it's for these reasons that we use the categories bad and gay as provocations just like the word failure here is a provocation, to talk more deeply about what we think all of these words to mean. Now, if it's not clear enough that we're not writing as homophobes, you can ask our boyfriends or our lovers or our friends. Both of us are deeply shaped by homosexuality, but also deeply unsatisfied by it. This project then is a dance through homosexuality's usable and abusable pasts. We learn from the broad spectrum of theory by and about queer and trans people and write as we must from our position as white gay men. When gay men become fascists, how did their homosexuality affect their attraction to a politics that venerates the male body of the state as though it were a go-go boy dancing on a box? When a king takes young male lovers and is then blackmailed, and when the process of forcing peasants off their land is tied to the same moral opprobrium that threatens the king, what are the transactions of power and influence at play? When a bisexual anthropologist, Margaret Mead, relies on primitivist projections of colonized others to find answers for how she might live now, in a society that sees her queerness as terrifying, as backwards, as a threat to the modern, how might her desires have affected the mythic nostalgia of her work, and thus the course of 20th century anthropological thinking? Why have configurations of identity and desire that might seem to be well past their sell-by date continue to hold such power over so many people, including us, the authors? Why can't we finally rid ourselves of homosexuality, in other words, and do something else, something better instead? Ultimately, this project is a project of demystification and an act of love. Gay is good went the old slogan, but it's no good at all on its own. Many of the queers with the very worst political goals have wanted to position themselves as heirs to a secret or magical kingdom, as the inheritors of a race of heroes. The process of making the movement and the identity has often involved reifying, recreating, and worshiping power and evil in their most brute forms. Maybe it's time that homosexuality itself dies, that we find new, more functional, and more appropriate configurations for our politics and our desires. Or maybe being queer is just as transitory and incomplete as anything else. Maybe all of us are lost and scared, subject to forces beyond our control, and trying to figure out how to configure our unruly desires and our politics into an ethical way of being in the world. If there is anything of queerness to be saved, it is its destruction and reshaping of the concept of the family. Not born into fixed kin, we get to choose. This choice is a social project, but also a political one, of understanding what kind of political we, what kind of subject we wish to belong to. Understanding how we became a we in the first place, and interrogating the extent to which that we even makes sense, might help more of us choose better. Then the real work begins. As Roderick Ferguson argues in One-Dimensional Queer, it is in these alliances that the parts of gay liberation worth saving originated, and it is to these alliances that any queer politics worth its salt must now turn. It is only through solidarity and alliance that liberation is possible. It is also as part of the same process that we can build towards a better form of being, realizing in ourselves new facets of being together, new ways to inhabit what Foucault called the slantwise, the diagonal lines cut through the social fabric. For alongside our history of homosexuality drawn from the malignant forces of our culture, run brilliant counter-histories, experiences of alliance and solidarity that offer us alternative futures should we wish to dream them forward. The labor union representing marine cooks and stewards in 1930s California, slowly radicalizing under pressure from members upset with racism in the ranks. Eventually, they form a communist, anti-racist, pro-queer union. No race baiting, no red baiting, no queen baiting is their slogan. One member of that union goes on to co-found the Mattachine Society, one of the first gay rights organizations in the United States. On a June night in 1969, a multiracial group of working class street kids, drag queens, trans women, sex workers, and sissies, not at all the kinds of people who think of themselves necessarily as the subjects of heroic politics, get pissed off and resist arrest and take the streets and riot. Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson, two crucial participants there at Stonewall, create an organization called Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, demanding that gay power include fighting back against police and fighting for gay men and trans women in prisons. 1970s gay liberation evolves along the explicit model of alliance with anti-colonial and third worldist liberation groups. A group of Black lesbian socialist feminists, the Combahee River Collective, developed a theory of the relationship between politics and their sexuality, insisting if they are not free, then no one will be. With the right-wing politics of the 1980s and brutal austerity and attacks on democracy and collective political, cultural, and social expression, gays and lesbians join minors to fight back against the Thatcher government and secure a dignified livelihood for both very different social groups. And as AIDS ravages queer communities in the 1990s, we organize, we create direct service organizations, we help people survive, we fight for free pharmaceutical care and healthcare for drug users, for people living on the street, for patients to be, for patents to be lifted on life-saving medications that people in the global south can survive. It's not always so easy though, especially when subjects are marked by whiteness and other forms of power and privilege, to neatly separate the good from the bad, the right from the wrong. We're not here to cancel anybody. If we did, we'd have to cancel ourselves. But the answer is not to simply stan our heroes and shush about their fails and flaws and failures and faults. Rather, it's to understand how people, and ultimately how we, have been made by history, how we and they have failed, and how we might succeed. The drag performer Taylor Mack, at the opening of Judy's 24-hour-long concert of American popular music, declares Judy's intent to, quote, honor the past, address the present, and dream the future forward. We get to choose what we will dream, what queerness, what faggotry, what transness, what gender trouble and abolition will be for us and with us and to us. It's one of these histories, or rather it's all of them. The past is still with us, the queer future beckons. And so that's the Bad Gays Manifesto, fresh from the introduction of our forthcoming book.
It's just amazing. So if somebody wanted to read,
I felt myself getting queenier and queenier as I was reading that. I was like,
no, you were just fine. If somebody wanted to read the manifesto, is it on your website now?
No, no. In fact, you should. You're getting a sneak preview here. No one has seen this but Hugh and I and our editor. We have a book coming out from Verso about a year from now, so next summer, and this material forms part of the introduction to that book. And then in that book, we will also profile 13 people, about half of whom are people that we've profiled on the show. So the show, we have 4 seasons now, each season of 10 people. So we have 40 profiles, a 5th season coming later this summer or fall. And so half of the people in the book will be completely new, and half of them will be deeper looks at people that we've taken a look at on the show. And the show doesn't have, I mean, we have definitely themes that we've come back to, and we've kind of used the 4 seasons of the show that we've made to begin to explore some of this territory and to kind of figure out what the shape of all of it was. In putting the book together, we decided to try to make a more coherent overall story instead of just presenting something that was super coffee table-y, or just, you know, here's something or here's something, but to try to sort of fit all of this into some kind of larger framework, which meant unfortunately leaving some of the more funny people out. I think the show is a bit overall lighter than the book will be, because on the show we can, you know, have a lot of fun talking about Liberace for an hour. And in the book, we were making ourselves be much more kind of restrictive in terms of how we wanted to use these stories to kind of tell this counter history, and make this kind of provocative claim, and really realizing over the course of writing the book that what we were trying to do was figure out this sort of much bigger thing of why we felt this wasn't working and what that meant.
Well, yes, of course. And of course, that's what I heard as I heard your words and your analysis there. And, you know, there's a much bigger issue that you and Huey have put on the table here with regard to that manifesto, as far as queer theory and gay studies go out there. I mean, you're really asking a very, very big question. But
well, it's also not a question. I just want to make it very clear. This is not, we're not the first or only people to answer this question. And there's some scholars that we talk about here, but this is secondary level, writerly and theoretical work. I think one of the big motivations of the show and the book is that there are so many extraordinary conversations that are happening in relatively small, but very important and influential, and linked academic and activist circles. And yet in so many of the kind of big splashy conversations about queer history, which is something that has been, I think, more and more a theme in the past few years. We've had this sort of renaissance of, I mean, suddenly you can get a queer history book published from a trade publisher, which is not something that was true necessarily 10 years ago, unless you were one of a very few people. But a lot of that is still happening in this much more simplistic register. And our theory the entire time has been that more people are ready for this more interesting conversation. And so the hope of the book is, I think, to try to make some of those connections. And we've been really lucky to have the incredible writing and work that we have to kind of cite and be in conversation with. We're still sort of working out exactly how. I mean, of course, the book is going to be very deeply cited, but we're also thinking about how to be sort of as generous as possible through it in terms of making sure that people are able to find their way through a particular idea or theme, something really interests them, are able to kind of find their way through to the thing that really influenced our thinking. Because there are so many brilliant people writing about this stuff at the moment.
Fair enough. And of course, I think the relationship to the project, or I'm sorry, to the podcast and the Bad Gay project is all makes sense. But you've raised, and again, not new, I certainly take your point there. But you have in this manifesto presented a new iteration. It is an iteration of today. And so is taking everything that you folks have worked on, but it does, and you can say you want to pass on this question, and that's totally fair, particularly given the project that you're working on. But now that you have sort of put it out there for us to think about, and you've put a lot of work into this, into the research and into the writing and to the expression of ideas. Let me ask you the question now. Are you ready to say whether or not homosexual identity is a failure? And I ask that question because we all know that homosexual identity and heterosexual identity, as you point out, is a recent construct. It's only been around for 120, 130 years. It is an identity that didn't exist before the last 100 X number of years. People either performed same-sex acts or they didn't. And there were moral judgments about it one way or the other. But somehow we went down this path. I guess we know why. But you raise the question again about whether or not homosexual identity is a failure. And are you ready to answer that question? And again, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but it is sort of interesting because it's so much a part of what we just heard.
Oh yeah, it is, and it's and yet, as much as it's a part of what we just heard, it's also I think there's a. I want to answer that with a very deeply qualified yes, and I'll qualify my yes by saying that I don't. I want to call it a failure without being able to remove myself from it. That there's I think sometimes for various complicated reasons, kinds of critique are interpreted as totalizing in a way that I don't necessarily mean to be here. And what I don't want to do is to say that I'm declaring homosexuality a failure from the pristine position of being outside of it. And that I have now learned more than all of you. And so I'm looking back at all of you, the people still trapped in this thing, and saying, oh, no, it's this, you're still hopelessly compromised and you're there and you're doing all of these messy things. And I found this way forward. What's been fascinating about working on this project is realizing the extent to which all of these things are complicated. And it really is. I mean, we said this, I sort of joked about this earlier. And I almost hate to use the word because you don't want to give ammunition to the people who are trying to turn cancel culture into the civil rights issue of our time with, oceans exploding on fire and cops shooting unarmed Black people in the street. But the point of the show is not to list people and to then try to take them down a notch, or to sort of, let's say, here's this person, you thought they were so great. Well, actually, here's all of the, here's why they're problematic or something. Instead, what we're often confronted with on the show is the extent to which a lot of these people do terrible things for completely understandable reasons, and the ways in which the path to a life that we might think of from the contemporary historical present, especially in the context of thinking about sort of a gay rights movement, the path towards the good life, or the life that we would remember rather fondly, and the path towards being a literal Nazi are often in the moment not particularly far apart. And I think the only thing to do with that is to be humbled and to understand the kinds of complicity and the violence towards other, of the comfort for the self that one often helps enact when one is in the position that a lot of the people who have been really influential in defining what actually existing homosexuality is are in, which is the position, which is frankly my position. And I don't want to presume anything about anyone else here participating or watching, but the position of essentially being at or near the top of the structural hierarchy, but for the question of sexuality. And I think for different generations at different times in different places, that but is of a different size, and that but has led to different forms of solidarity, and some of them have been more real than others. And I certainly think people can go beyond, but I think that's where a lot of the tension kind of comes out of, and that's what we've been kind of working our way towards trying to describe and trying to understand, and in looking at how these lives kind of play out. Because you really do look at someone. Well, for example, this someone we profile in the book is the most uncomplicatedly good person that we talk about in the book. A guy named Roger Casement, one of the best looking people you ever see a picture of. Look him up. Just, you'll be happy you looked at a picture of this guy. He's sent by the British government to investigate colonial abuses in the Congo, when the Congo is being ruled under the personal fiefdom of King Leopold of Belgium. He writes reports that are sort of make headlines and lead to some sanctioning of Belgium in Europe. He then goes to Brazil and does the same thing in Brazil. He's then arrested for running guns to the IRA and is convicted and shot for treason. The entire time he's doing all of this, he keeps two sets of diaries. He keeps the white diaries in which he's writing all of the notes for these sort of journalistic reports. And in the black diaries, he's keeping some of the most joyously raunchy memoirs of a size queen that you will ever see. And you look at Casement and you think, so how are we thinking of him as bad? Well, in the one sense, there's the sense in which he dies in infamy. And then so he's sort of the figure of the evil queer, and his queerness is very much used in the trial. The black diaries come to light in his treason trial and are used as evidence against him in the British press. And in fact, there are still some kind of hardcore Irish nationalists who think that they're forgeries. I think the British made it all up. They didn't. It's not true. But then also you have the context. You're watching someone as he moves in his life from being a very sort of loyal soldier of British Empire towards being enough of an opponent of it that he's arrested for running guns to the IRA, and gets there through, or in some sense through, or with, or in conversation with these sexual and romantic relationships with these young Black and Indigenous and Latin men, that where he's writing about them in ways and in terms that I think, I mean, he's describing seemingly relatively joyous and consensual encounters, and yet these encounters are completely wrapped up, as Javier Uriarte and other people who've written about this have spoken about, completely wrapped up in the colonial nature, in some sense, of the relationship between them. And so, you know, even when you get to the good story in the book, you still have all of these kind of complicating factors, and all of that together, I think, provides this more complicated and nuanced picture. So, I mean, yes, it's a failure, but it's, I mean, everything is a failure, right? I mean, it to say it's a failure, I don't know if it's a failure more than heterosexuality has been a failure. Certainly don't think that. But I think I think it's failed to do, homosexuality rather, has failed to, or certainly gayness has failed to live up to gay liberation. And And that's an interesting question as to why. And it's also an interesting question as to whether, if it had lived up to it, if it would have failed less. I don't know, this is infinitely complicated, and I'm just spinning out further and further. But
yeah, of course, it's very complicated. This is just immensely fascinating. We're going to have to wrap up here, but two quick things. The website for Bad Gays is badgays.com.
Badgayspod.com.
Right.
BADGAYSPOD.com going in the chat.
Great. And so throw that in there so people will be able to see that. And then the book is going to be coming out next year in 2022. And so we're going to
be coming out in summer of 2022 from Verso in New York and London simultaneously. And we'll have more announcements on that soon. And that's if you follow the show, then we'll be there.
Push that along. And this conversation will definitely have to keep on going. I want to do a shout out to my colleague, Paula. Are you back there? Just want to say hi to you and thank you for being here.
Paula.
Thank you, Paula. Thank you. And I want to thank all of you for being here. Feel free to forward this to others, this conversation. We just hit the surface here. And so it's really just amazing. There's a lot to be said about all this stuff. And so we'll see you all next week. Ben, thank you so much for staying up with us tonight. Give my kisses to Berlin. It's a great city. And so, yes, thank you. Thank you.
I will.
It's all great. And thank you, everybody. If you're in South Florida, please come by to see us at the Stonewall National Museum and Archives. Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Everybody, thank you all so much.